Okay, so in this example, we're going to go ahead and solve this quadratic. And there are multiple methods that we use to solving quadratic. One of them is quadratic formula. That's why I have the quadratic formula here. But for the most part, we might look at factoring and say, hey, what two numbers multiply to 6 but add to -3? And those are numbers that we don't know off the top of our head. So we could go with completing the square, which would work. I have a tendency to always pretty much go towards a quadratic formula if factoring doesn't work. I'm comfortable with it, and if I have imaginary solutions, works out nicely. Completing the square, imaginary solutions would come out fine also. But what I might do, because it doesn't factor, if I had my graphing calculator, I would graph this guy, and this graph is probably going to look something like this. And notice it doesn't cross the x-axis. Well, that right there tells me that my solutions are going to be imaginary solutions. So by looking at the picture, I know what to expect when I actually use the quadratic formula. So let's go ahead and get started. My b is -3, so I have a -3 plus or minus the square root of b squared. So -3 squared minus 4 times a times c. And right away, all over 2 times a. I look at what's inside the radical, which is our discriminant, right? And I know that 3 squared, we're savvy enough to know that that's 9, and this is going to be 24. I'm going to get a negative number underneath the discriminant. So what that means is I'm going to have two imaginary solutions. But this example, that's a little bit of review. This example is, well, how do I work with the imaginary value in the root? So I'm going to go through and start to simplify, and I get a negative next to a negative, so that turns into a positive 3, plus or minus the square root of 9 minus 24 all over 12. Okay? So now I'm going to go ahead, and 9 minus 24 is 13. And it's negative, right? And that's going to be divided by 12. Okay, sorry about that. So now we have 3 plus or minus, and to get rid of the 13, that's the same as negative square root of 1 times square root of 13. The square root of -1 is I, so I can go ahead and change that square root to I, and 12. And that is my final answer, and that's how I'd format it. So the trick is, if you got a negative, you write I in front, and then you turn the radical term into a positive value instead of a negative value. Now, with this specific situation, we have a 3 and a 12, and the 3 and the 12, they can reduce, but because there's no number here in front of the I that reduces with the 3 and the 12, this is the simplest form that we're going to get this guy in. Okay? That's how we're going to use quadratic formula when we get a negative value underneath the square root.